समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
In recent months, explosions of youth rage on the streets of South Asia cities have swept aside governments in countries as different as Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, now Nepal. Look a bit further and you'll see similar things going on in Indonesia, the Philippines, Mexico. And it was just in 2023, we sometimes forget, that thousands of young people did the unthinkable in Pakistan, storming military facilities and even stealing strawberries from the home of the Lahore Corps commander. Economic frustration, corruption, the lack of prospects and jobs, the weakness of state institutions, conspiracy, all of these have been held out as plausible reasons for what's been happening. If you've been watching the WhatsApp groups Uncle G's my age really shouldn't be wasting time on, you'll have come across even more colorful theories. The CIA did it. There are color revolutions, destabilization. But there's one simple explanation that nobody has paid much attention to, possibly because it seems just too simple. It isn't the internet or drugs or sex. It's our kids. Thank you for watching this episode of The Print Explorer, and for those who have been regularly watching us, a special thanks. Viewers and readers like you have come to value The Print for the granular reporting we do from the field and our highly researched analysis. Journalism like this costs money though, and we need your support. You'll find links on how to subscribe in the comments pane below. I'm Praveen Swami and I'm a contributing editor to The Print. Today I'll be taking you through how the violence on India's rim is connected to something known as youth bulges, essentially societies with high percentages of populations aged between 15 and 24. And look at why these demographic circumstances, these youth bulges, have through history been entwined with the making of turning points. The revolution began with an argument over a crate of bananas and 2 crates of pears. Like each morning, local authorities had arrived at the market in the small Tunisian town of Sidi Bouzid, telling unlicensed vendors to vacate the street. And like most mornings, some had responded to the police with arguments and taunts. The municipal police responded by confiscating one young man's fruit and his weighing scales. "Now what should I do?" the man shouted at an officer. "Should I weigh my fruit with your breasts?" Faiza Hamdi, the officer at whom this sexist taunt was directed, wasn't intimidated. Long used to dealing with aggressive, ill-behaved young men, she responded with a tight slap to his face. Later that day though, the fruit vendor, Muhammad Bouazizi, doused himself with paint thinner and set himself on fire. He died 18 days later in a military hospital. The fire Bouazizi lit that day in 2009 would rage across the region. The Arab Spring, they called it. Local dictators from Libya's Muammar al-Gaddafi to Egypt's Hosni Mubarak were overthrown. Tunisia for a time saw democracy flower until new President Kais Saied began to choke back at its roots. For decades before all this happened, we know people had been paying a lot of attention to youth bulge societies. At Langley, the headquarters of the Central Intelligence Agency, a specialist social sciences group had been studying the relationship between political instability and the size of its youth cohort, aged from 15 to 24, as I told you, relative to the population. The 1985 study conducted by the CIA, which has now been declassified, classified Bangladesh, Nepal, Indonesia, Egypt, and Iraq as among the countries of particularly high risk from emerging youth bulges. This wasn't a surprise, of course, to the small community of demographers that study the politics of demography and of the social evolution. It shouldn't really have been a surprise to anyone else either. Economists are fixated on the idea of a youth dividend, which is the prosperity that develops with a young, educated, employed population. But there's a flip side to that youth dividend. Too many young people with too little to do mean trouble, as the parents of any teenager will tell you. Looking out at the streets where the Arab Spring would erupt, the experts had seen it coming. The economist Nader Kabani has recorded that youth unemployment in the Middle East was the highest in the world at that time, touching a staggering 30%. Even though educational access had improved dramatically, the quality of jobs on offer didn't. Large numbers of those seeking work, the economists Ragui Assad and Ghada Barsoon observed in Egypt, could find only low-wage opportunities in the informal sector. And that meant more frustration. Anthropologist M. Chloe Mulderig has perceptively pointed out, and I quote, "The most basic of social contracts that children will one day grow up, begin to contribute productively to society, and then raise families of their own, had been broken for an entire generation of youth in the Arab world." Instead, Mulderig noted, their generation was living in an undignified liminal state of pre-adulthood. That is, all these young men had kind of grown to the age of being adults, but had acquired none of the privileges or skills or opportunities that come with being a grown-up. And think about that. The way things have always gone in society means parents invest in their kids, spend their savings on education, all in the hope they'll get decent jobs and contribute to family wealth. But in these youth bulge situations, there are too many young people competing for too few jobs. Young people can't be married at the ages their father were, which opens a can of toxic masculinity issue worms. In many societies, the state of pre-adulthood has helped grow a toxic culture of gender aggression. Hamdi, the Tunisian police officer who started the Arab Spring with her slap, made this insightful observation that really struck with me, and these were her words. Had a man hit him, none of this would have happened. And this is exactly the kind of lumpen behavior you see every so often at street corners. Young men without opportunity, without jobs, have only one section of society they can pick on, which is young women. Let's zoom out now a tiny bit and look at the large picture about how youth bulges have played out from time to time in the rest of the world. Large-scale ethnic violence in Kenya from 1991 to 1993, scholar Colin Kell has documented, was rooted similarly in demographic pressures. The ability of the economy to absorb a rapidly growing labor force, Kell has observed, declined as the private sector slumped and the number of jobs in the public sector, then Kenya's largest source of employment, stopped growing. Kenya continues to see ongoing political violence, by the way, which is turning uglier by the day, as political groups rely ever more on criminal gangs to provide them muscle. The most awful case of this phenomenon we have in the world today is Mexico, where the cost in the lives of drug crime now dwarfs that of most modern wars. Large groups of disempowered young men join cartels not just to make some money, but because having a gun and some power gives them a sense of agency that life simply doesn't offer. Low education on the one hand and high youth unemployment on the other helps the drug cartels draw an endless supply of labor. Large numbers of studies show similar patterns have hit other Latin American countries as they transited and traveled through their own youth bulges. The decline in fertility brought about through family planning programs helped most of these countries, scholars Julia Zinkina and Alexei Andreev have demonstrated. But in some countries like Haiti, the violence so thoroughly gutted the state that progress seems to have become impossible. The whole country seems colonized by gangs and gangster violence. Political scientist Ted Gurr, who was one of the first people to start paying attention to this, noted in a 1981 study that cities with high youth populations, youth male populations, had crime rates, and I quote, higher than in times and places where the population is older. The coming of age of the post-war generation of youth, that is post-Second World War, Gurr recorded, is closely related to the onset of major increases in personal and property crime in both the United States and in Britain. Now there, of course, you had relatively well-resourced states that could get themselves out of trouble, but that's not true everywhere else. To get a sense of what all this means, you just really need to open your front door. In a 2005 paper examining violent conflict in India, researcher Henrik Urdal noted that the risk of armed conflicts and riots had a significant statistical association with youth bulges. The risk of armed conflict, he noted, is particularly pronounced when youth bulges go together with great male surpluses. That is, you have too many young men fighting for too few jobs. A review of the global evidence similarly assessed that large youth cohorts are associated with significantly increased risk of domestic armed conflict, terrorism, and riots. India is a lot better organized in institutional terms to deal with the violence of the kind we've witnessed in Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, or now in Nepal. The truth, though, is that certain kinds of violence have become endemic in our society, even if they're not political or directed at the state. We all just accept that every year some young coward pilgrims will beat up store owners and burn down cars. No one really thinks the police will do anything significant about it. We expect marginal political groups or the extreme religious right wing to lynch people. And worst of all, we accept that women will be harassed in routine, horrific ways. That's just how it is, right? That's what a youth bulge looks like, and no one can fix it. India should have been creating 1 million jobs a year for the last 20 years, as the security scholar Ajay Sani hasn't tired of pointing out. Only then would its youth bulge be an opportunity. But India hasn't got anywhere near that number in any of those years. Less than 1 in 4 Indians aged between 15 and 24, World Bank data shows, now participate meaningfully in the labor force. And 25% of youth job seekers can't find a job. The situation's been getting steadily worse, and in a country where over half the population now is below 25. As I said, India needs to be creating millions and millions of jobs. It's just never come close to meeting that demand. The main occupation of many young Indians, as the anthropologist Craig Jeffrey somewhat bleakly puts it, has been waiting for life to happen. There are some experts who think that having more children in India will give us a more vibrant economy than a greying China. And in my view, that's nonsense. China can increase productivity through technology. It can harness robots and automation to conduct the kinds of roles it would have needed low-paid labor for. But we'll just be stuck with more kids whose life revolves around scoring a data pack and wasting time watching a movie. And so the question arises, what comes next? Like every other revolution, the springtime of peoples in 1848, the great series of European revolutions which gave the Arab Spring its name, everything went back to normal after a while. A little bit better here or a little bit worse there. The ideas that came out of the 1848 revolutions were of enormous consequence, of course. A new generation of Europeans took their identity from nationalism, which took an increasingly toxic form as the 19th century wore along. Large numbers of young people drew away from their local religions and local identities and began to see themselves as parts of large messianic collectives. Their massive herd, they thought, would bring pride and change. The historian Rudiger Hartmann notes the 1848 movement, the original springtime of nations, didn't have a single big idea for change. The movement drew from ideologically eclectic ideas thrown up by young people, including religious fanatics, various kinds of socialists, ultra-nationalists, all kinds of people. The leadership, Hartmann notes, tongue-in-cheek I'm guessing, was, and I quote, dominated by young men of the starving writer variety, as well as journalists and members of related occupations. If that sounds a lot like the Nepali youth trying to run the country through a Discord server, that's because really, without being rude, it is. The inchoate rage persisted long after the 1848 revolution though. It fed the impulses of the First World War, leading that generation of young men into the killing fields of Ypres and Somme, where a whole generation of the flower of European youth sacrificed themselves in the mud from 1914 to 1918. Economic historians have noted that demographic shifts underpin many such crises in history. The collapse of the English state in 1640-1641 came because of factional feuds within the elite, fiscal crisis, and economic distress. Each of these, though, the sociologist and political scientist Jack Goldstone has proposed, was precipitated by a huge surge in population which the existing social structure could not handle. And I quote from Goldstone, "Youth have played a prominent role in political violence throughout recorded history, and the existence of a youth bulge, that famous high proportion from 15 to 24, has historically been associated with times of prolonged political crisis." Academic and historian Norm Cohn's work has shown that young people were, through history, drawn to millenarian movements, which promise some kind of post-apocalypse utopia. Social histories of the First Crusades, during which large-scale pogroms against Jews were conducted as thousands and tens of thousands of young people marched to Jerusalem, they gave young people a central role in shaping events. It's also been true of many of the crises of the modern world. The high proportion of young adults in pre-Nazi Germany, Herbert Moller has suggested, helped lay the foundations for fascism. Fascism's rise in Germany came about just as the historically unprecedented cohort born between 1900 and 1914 came on the job market. The closure of immigration into America and the Great Depression reduced opportunities for this European cohort and sealed their fate. From the alarm lights flashing all around us, India should be drawing some obvious lessons. And those lessons aren't about coming up with some big conspiracy theory about why all this is happening. First, it's not enough just to be talking about jobs and education. These need to be national priorities, up on the top of the list, even higher than dealing with a pandemic or a war. Labor isn't only an economic good, it's also the warp and weft of our social fabric. Second, India needs to realize that even its best efforts may fail, that it may be too late to do what needs doing for this youth bulge. The country's cities in particular will then need far more professional policing, sensitive to the needs of young people, but also effective at enforcing law and order to contain violence when it does occur. The day before Nepal began burning, no one thought it possible. And no one imagined that the all-powerful Bangladesh Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina Wajed would have to hide out in New Delhi. There was no one who thought that the home of the corps commander of the Pakistan Army in Lahore would be robbed of its strawberries and peacocks. And yet, we know it can happen because we saw it happen. We've been warned, and it's time for Indian policymakers to get utterly serious on the lessons of what our neighborhood is screaming at us. Thank you for watching this episode of The Print Explorer.